The following program is a work of satire and is intended for entertainment purposes only. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, or products is intended or should be inferred. Welcome to the Conflation Station, a place where anything is possible. There are moments in a man's life when certainty, once firm as granite, begins to erode beneath the quiet pressure of doubt. For Thomas Martin, undertaker by trade and genealogist by obsession, that moment did not arrive with a scream, nor with a revelation shouted from the heavens, but with a single, silent, irreconcilable inconsistency. A date which inexplicably appeared chiseled on the blank headstone he placed in his backyard cemetery for himself. A date on which, until now, he believed himself to be among the living. You are about to witness a man standing at the intersection of two irreconcilable truths, one written in flesh and breath, and the other etched into cold, indifferent granite. And like all such intersections, this one exists just beyond the borders of reason at the departure terminal of the Conflation Station. Thomas Martin had always trusted death records. Death records did not lie. Death records did not misremember. Death records did not dream. So when he stood before his own unmarked headstone at the rear of his private family cemetery on that cold November night, and discovered his headstone now had the date of his own demise engraved onto it, Thomas Martin did not dismiss it. He investigated it. He was not a man given to hysteria. He was a man given to procedure. The engraving was precise, professional, irrefutable. Thomas Martin, date of death, November 24th. The very day he had completed the construction of the cemetery precisely 1 year ago. The very day he had celebrated its creation. The very day he distinctly remembered standing among the stones, alive, breathing, and satisfied with what he had achieved. For Martin, however, the irony of death and creation taking place at the same time, much like the mother who births a child and dies on the delivery table, was compelling and required his full attention. "Is it possible?" he whispered, not in denial, but in calculation, because in his mind, if a death date on his headstone existed, it must be verified. And so Thomas Martin, an undertaker by trade and a genealogist with an obsession with finality, did what he thought any reasonable man confronted with his situation would do. The next morning, he made a phone call to a man whose name was stored in his contacts under the listing of gravedigger. The man's name was Harold Finch. Names mattered little to Thomas Martin unless they were accompanied by a date of death. Later that morning, Mr. Finch arrived at the appointed time in a beat-up old pickup truck with a backhoe in tow on the trailer. Finch stepped out, surveyed the yard, and paused. "Funny place for a cemetery," he muttered. Thomas Martin, standing beside his own headstone, spoke to Finch. "I require excavation," he said plainly. Finch scratched his chin. "You sure about this? Ground looks pretty settled." "Yes, I am. It is essential," said Martin. There was something in Martin's tone that discouraged further questioning. Finch nodded slowly and returned to his truck, where he offloaded his small excavator onto the ground. After several turns of a key, the machine coughed to life, metal groaned, and once the exhaust began billowing smoke, Finch drove it to the location, and the first incision into the earth was cut. Thomas Martin stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, watching with clinical attention as the bucket bit into the soil. There was no resistance, no sign of prior disturbance. The ground broke easily as though untouched for decades. 6 feet, Finch called out over the engine's rumble. "Precisely," said Martin. The digging continued. Layer by layer, the earth gave way. Dark soil turned over into pale sublayers. Roots snapped, stones shifted. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, then a sound, not of earth, not of stone, a hollow, unmistakable resonance. Finch halted the machine. He climbed down slowly, peering into the pit. "Well," he said after a moment, "that's not right." Thomas Martin stepped forward and looked. There, partially exposed beneath the remaining soil, was the curved lid of an oak coffin, a coffin that had no business being there. The wood was polished, unweathered, untouched by rot or decay, and affixed to its surface a small brass nameplate. Finch wiped the dirt away with his glove. He read it aloud. His voice was certain. Thomas Martin. A pause. Then more quietly, November 24th, same date as the stone. Silence settled over the yard. Thomas Martin did not move, nor did he speak, but something within him, something that had always relied upon order, shifted slightly out of alignment. "This coffin," he said, "must be exhumed." Finch hesitated. "You saying someone buried you in your own backyard?" Martin replied, "I am not saying that. I am merely seeking confirmation." And now it's time for us to take a brief respite and listen to an intermezzo conceived by world-renowned composer E. Dudeks, after which the saga of Thomas Martin will resume. We continue. Chains were now secured around the coffin, and with the skill of an archaeologist, Finch carefully unearthed it. The backhoe lifted it from the ground with a slow, deliberate motion, as though reluctant to disturb whatever logic held it in place. The soil beneath revealed no prior excavation, no disturbed layers, no collapsed walls. It was as though the coffin had always been there, or had never been buried at all. The coffin was loaded onto Finch's flatbed and transported to the mortuary. The journey, ever so short, was conducted in near silence. Inside the embalming room, beneath a sterile light, the two men, using all the strength they could muster, placed the coffin onto the work table at the room's center. Finch moved away and stood near the door. "I don't like this," he admitted. Martin ignored him. Martin approached the coffin, ran his fingers along its smooth oak surface, examined the hinges, the latch. Everything was perfectly intact, untouched, untarnished. It appeared as though the coffin was prepared for a burial that had never occurred, or had already occurred in some otherworldly version of events. Thomas Martin inhaled slowly, then he opened it. The lid did not make a sound when lifted. Martin paused. He looked down at an empty coffin. Nothing, no cadaver, no remains, no lining disturbed. The interior of the coffin was pristine and empty, a vessel awaiting an occupant that had never arrived, or one who had already departed by some means of Houdini-esque escape. Finch let out a breath that he didn't realize he was holding. "Well," he said, attempting at humor that failed to take shape, "good news is, you're not in there, Mr. Martin." Martin did not respond. He stared into the coffin, into its absence, into its contradiction, because for the first time in his life, he had encountered a record that refused to resolve itself. The headstone said he was dead. The coffin bore his name. The dates matched. The burial site existed. And yet there was no corpse, no completion, which raised a question far more troubling than death itself. What precisely had been recorded, and by whom? The remainder of the day passed in a blur of quiet calculations. Finch departed quickly, eager to distance himself from whatever strange business he had become part of. Thomas Martin remained in the mortuary alone. He closed the coffin, then opened it again, then closed it once more, each time expecting, perhaps, that something might change. It did not. The emptiness persisted, and with it a new and unfamiliar sensation: abject uncertainty. That night, Thomas Martin returned to the cemetery. The stones stood as they always had, 37 markers, divided neatly between virtue and condemnation, and at the rear one single stone, his own. Now no longer an abstraction, now no longer theoretical, but substantiated, verified, a grave, a coffin, a date, everything required for a complete record, except one thing: the corpse. Martin walked slowly among the headstones. His steps were measured. His thoughts were precise, yet increasingly strained. If one record is incomplete, he murmured, then others must also be examined. He stopped before his mother's headstone. The date gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Complete, final, certain. Or was it? He turned toward the rest of the cemetery. 37 names, 37 deaths, 37 conclusions he had accepted without question. But now a possibility had emerged, a possibility that threatened the very foundation of his life's work. What if the records were not merely documenting reality? What if they were creating it, or worse, preceding it? Thomas Martin felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The awareness that he might not be the sole author of his carefully constructed world, that perhaps someone or something else was in control, and he was merely another entry waiting to be finalized. The following morning, Martin made another phone call to Finch. "I need you back," Martin said. Then a pause. "For what?" said Finch. "A full excavation," said Martin. Another pause. "Of what?" said Finch. Thomas Martin looked out toward the cemetery at the rows of headstones, at the carefully divided sections, at the silent names awaiting confirmation. "All of them," he said. There was a long silence at the other end of the line. Then Finch spoke, quieter than before. "That'll take all day." "I'm aware," said Martin. "And what if we find more of those?" said Finch. Thomas Martin gazed out on his own headstone, showing the very date that had already claimed him. Then he replied, "We will finally understand the record." He hung up and stepped outside. The wind moved gently through the yard. The stone stood motionless, but if one were to look very closely, just for a moment, it might appear that the arrangement once again had shifted ever so slightly, as though making room, as though preparing for what would soon be uncovered. Because in a place where death is not an end but a document, where graves exist before bodies and coffins wait for occupants, the act of digging is not merely excavation, it is revelation. And Thomas Martin, professional undertaker, genealogist, and now unwilling participant in his own uncertain chronology, is about to discover whether the rest of his family shares his peculiar condition, or whether something far more disturbing lies beneath the surface. Something that suggests the records were never his to control, only his to follow. But that, as they say, is a matter for another entry, another excavation, another journey leaving platform number 1 for the Conflation Station.